Hey, this is Anney, and welcome to Stuff I Never Told You, production of iHeartRadio. Yes, I'm still by myself. Samantha is down for the count with COVID right now. Like, we've got a lot of travel coming up, so trying to get ahead. And I will say for this episode, I am largely quoting one article from Tor.com called From the Exorcist to Talk to Me, Possession Films Teach Us to Fear the Wrong Things by J.R. Forasteros. I hope I got that somewhat correct. That my good friend Barry sent to me because he knows I love all things possession, which is funny. I thought it was kind of appropriate because we're wrapping up our religious miniseries. Promise. But I'm not religious. I am not religious at all, but I do find myself drawn to these stories. And we're really focusing on Western Christian ideas of possession for this. My mom wouldn't let me watch The Exorcist. She wouldn't let me have it in her house because she was so afraid of it. And I have just found myself gravitating to a lot of these stories sometimes. And sometimes that gives me pause. I'm like, why am I being drawn to this when I'm not religious? And I think that's, I don't believe in ghosts either, but I love ghost movies. So I don't think that's necessarily strange, but it is strange when a lot of Christian lore is wrapped up in it. One of my favorite movies now is The Exorcist. And another reason this was on my mind is because William Friedkin has died recently. And I also happened to see the new movie Talk to Me with some friends. There will be minor spoilers for that in here, but not that many. But when I was watching it, it just occurred to me, a lot of the stuff in this article, a lot from these quotes we're going to read, that I was kind of like, it's interesting who gets possessed in a lot of these movies, what that says. So that being said, let us start with our first quote. Possession films are inescapably religious. What that means changes from generation to generation and from culture to culture, as fans of South Korea's The Wailing can attest. The Exorcist is undeniably the grandfather of possession films as a subgenre. Directed by William Friedkin, The Exorcist was released in 1973 and is based on a book of the same name written by William Peter Blatty that was released in 1971. The Exorcist was a box office juggernaut, becoming the highest-grossing movie of all time, a title it held for 40 years, and receiving 10 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture. Now, if you haven't read about this movie and the reactions people had when it came out, they're quite dramatic. People were getting sick. They were passing out. It was a very intense, and for some people, very formative experience. I remember when I first started at this job, I asked my coworkers what was the, scariest movie they'd ever seen. I'd say over half of them said The Exorcist. And I would not describe them as religious. And it's just fascinating to me that it had that much of an impact. And I do think it's important to keep in mind the time when this came out and who was being possessed, what was the story going on behind it, in terms of you've got your single mother who is a career woman and her sweet daughter is the one that gets possessed. So, that being said, here's another quote to that point. The Exorcist is a baby boomer horror movie through and through. The good guys here are the institutional church, embodied by the two priests. Both the book and film were released in a time of cultural anxiety, particularly with regard to religion. The FDA authorized the birth control pill a decade later in 1960, which gave women control over their reproductive system for the first time in history, with predictable outcomes. Not just the free love movement of the 60s, but a massive change in marriage habits. In the 20 years after the pill was released, divorce rates more than doubled, while the percentage of adults over 18 who are married plummeted. Into this milieu, Blatty and Friedkin give us the story of a broken home in which a young girl is tormented by puberty, demon, and can only find solace when a father comes into the house. As Jude Doyle explains in Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers, Regan's smooth baby skin erupts and scabs over into weeping, discolored mess. She has outbursts of temper, insults, and resists authority figures, makes display of sheer pointless defiance. She talks obsessively about sex, mostly to shock people. She masturbates. She bleeds from her vagina. In other words, Regan becomes a teenager. Her demon is puberty. And yeah, I would also add she curses a lot. That's kind of a plot point. It's like, oh, she's cursing now. Basically, she goes from like your very innocent, in heavy quotes, young child to not a messy, angry, somewhat violent. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too nice. Violent. Obsessed with sex. Yeah. Obsessed with shocking people, like saying things to shock people. And she is she's at the right age for puberty for sure. And she does. I thought that was interesting, pointing out like the father has to come into the house. I hadn't really thought about that. And I also want to come back and do a follow-up episode about nuns now that the nun has become this horror icon, and talk about nuns and horror. But yeah, that's how she's saved, is a father comes into this house where her biological father is notably absent. She gets the church father is the one that saves her. The quote continues, "The Exorcist is famously based on a true story, an exorcism performed in St. Louis in 1949. The real child was a boy, not a girl, and he came from a two-parent home. The framework that resonated so strongly with moviegoers in 1973 was entirely artifice, a reflection not of the true story, but of white American anxieties." So yeah, that's interesting that they thought this would hit more with audiences, that it was a young girl. And in a lot of the exorcism movies I've seen, it is often a young girl or young woman. I had a friend say to me recently, I think he was talking about Monster Squad. It's been a long time since I've seen Monster Squad. But why did the virgin have to be a woman? Well, there was a lot of male virgins about. But yeah, I think that goes back to like the ultimate corruption in a lot of our horror is young, usually white girls who are innocent. But when it happens with men, I feel like it's much more often used as they kill their whole family or something, or are very violent. Whereas with women, it's much more like take their soul. That's just my experience. There's a lot of movies about possession and exorcism. The quote continues, "Compare that to James Wan's 2013 The Conjuring, also based on a true story. Though set in the early 1970s, The Conjuring embodies the anxieties of millennials rather than their boomer parents. The Warrens contact the Catholic Church to obtain an exorcism, but because the Perron family isn't Catholic, approval for the rite must come from the Vatican, and the Warrens are convinced the family won't survive long enough for that approval to come. In the reality, the child of another family did die in Bathsheba's care, and she was tried for murder, with rumors swirling that she had sacrificed the child in an act of witchcraft. The court found her innocent, however." But yeah, that movie is very much, my friends and I like to joke. Again, I enjoy this movie, but we like to joke that it's sort of like superhero Christians, like swooping in. And it is that the first one is very much about motherhood, and that's sort of how it's like Bathsheba's ultimate sin is that she's killing these children, and that's how they save the main woman, the mother of the family, is they remind her of like how important her children are to her, which is not necessarily a bad storyline. It's just worth examining why that is. There's also a lot of messaging about the dangers of not following God. There's a whole warning about, you need to get your children baptized, or else. sort of almost blaming them, like this wouldn't have happened if you had followed God. The quote continues, Ed Warren is successful not because of the church, but despite the church. What matters in The Conjuring is not religious affiliation, but belief, a particularly millennial attitude embodied by the phrase spiritual but not religious. Nearly a third of millennials claim no religious affiliation, compared with just 13% of boomers and 20% of Gen X, whose defining possession film might be the middle finger to the American dream, that is, Beetlejuice. And I think that's really fascinating. I think that's interesting to look in how it's shifted with generations. Because I would agree. I when I read that, the whole spiritual but not religious, I was like, yeah, that describes a lot of my friends. I remember having a very long conversation with a big group of my friends about this movie that was pretty much about like the Vatican was trying to cover up this lost, I don't know, part of the Bible, and the lost part of the Bible was just saying like the religion it's not the church, it's not the stone, it's not the building that is spiritual or religious or is going to save you. It's within you. It's being spiritual. And it was funny to me because that movie, I can't even remember the name. I just tried to. Some of you, I bet some of you do know. Let me write in. But it wasn't like a really well-known movie. But a lot of us had seen it and had heard that part and were like, yeah, resonated. But the quote continues, to generalize a bit, boomers love church. Gen Z rebelled against church. Millennials look for spirituality outside of church. Gen Z doesn't think about church much at all. Which there has been a lot of headlines about that recently. I've seen quite a few, and we have been talking about that in our religious miniseries. Okay, and then here is final quote. It's perhaps an unavoidable feature of possession films that they teach us to be afraid of the wrong things. Often what's implicitly demonized is equality and dignity. Single parents, female sexuality, grief. We didn't even cover how Insidious Chapter 2 demonizes transgender people. Possession films, whether intentionally or not, communicate that a world without institutionalized faith is a world where we're at the mercy of evil powers that wish to do us harm. But when the institutions we're told should protect us prey upon us instead, maybe it's time to take our chances. Possession films, even those as groundbreaking as Talk to Me, are conservative at their heart. But maybe Gen Z has the right of it. Perhaps those institutions that have proven themselves so untrustworthy aren't worthy of conservation. Which I think relates back to what we've been talking about in this religious miniseries, that we have so many examples of harm that these institutions have done. And that's not to say they haven't done good and that inherently makes religious people somehow wrong or something like that. Not at all. I think it's just questioning, as always, these messages that are being communicated to us through entertainment that we enjoy, which I enjoy. Like I said, The Exorcist is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. I really love The Conjuring. But it has always struck me who is targeted, who is possessed, who does the saving, and that sort of message is still there. And I think a lot of us recognize that. I think a lot of us recognize that it's often very conservative in nature of like, oh, why does it have to be a virginal girl who gets possessed and is being tempted or going through puberty, aka a demon? I think a lot of us know that. But I just wanted to bring that up because I have been thinking about it recently. And in case anyone else has any other thoughts about it, maybe you remember the name of that movie I was talking about. I'm sure it's going to come to me right after this is over. Or if you have any suggestions, Samantha and I would love them. I'm really sad she wasn't here for this one, I bet. We'll have to come back to it. In the meantime, you can email us at stephaniemomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff One Never Told You. We have a TeePublic store and a book that you can buy at stuffyoushouldreadbooks.com. Thanks as always to our super producer Christina, our executive producer Maya, and our contributor Joey. And thanks to you for listening. Stuff One Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.